self-awareness of relationships. This, I think, is probably the most cutting edge thing that Fuel Ed does. We essentially know from the science, from the research, and from all the many decades of literature around adult attachment, that the way in which you were parented or cared for, if you had secure early relationships, you're more likely to build secure relationships later. If you had insecure early relationships, you're more likely to build insecure relationships later. And that matters for teachers because relationships are what drives learning.
School is in, but are you really ready to learn? Open your eyes to a new day in education with the Awakening Educator, a program specifically designed to explore a new, mindful way of educating our youth. Learn about social-emotional learning, new modalities of teaching, and the most relevant topics in education with your hosts, Susan Andrian and Megan Sweet. Susan and Megan will take you inside the issues by looking at them from different points of view, from policies and research to teaching models that are actually used in schools. There's never a dull moment in this classroom. Have any questions you'd like to ask? Maybe you have knowledge you'd like to share, and share your thoughts live on air. Grab a pen and paper and get ready to open your textbooks and minds to a new way of learning on the Awakening Educator.
Tag, you're it, Megan.
All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Awakening Educator. My name is Megan Sweet. I'm here, as always, with the lovely Susan Andrian. And we're really excited today to speak with a founder of Fuel Ed and one of the key partners within school, Fuel Ed, to talk about the connection they see between social emotional learning and teacher preparation and what that looks like in the classroom. So we're so excited to have both of you here, Megan and Kelley. Please introduce yourself. Maybe Megan, you can go first. Just a little bit about yourself, who you are, how you came to found Fuel Ed.
Absolutely. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having us. So my name is Megan Marcus. I'm the founder of Fuel Ed. My journey started back in kind of around 2010. My first professional aim was to be a therapist. And I was always really interested in people and people development and the power of relationships to help people heal and kind of look inward. But all of that changed when I had a really amazing opportunity to work with Dr. Lou Cozolino on his book called The Social Neuroscience of Education, which explored the science behind why relationships drive learning. And I was really compelled at this time by all of the science that shows the power and potential of relationships in education, teacher-student relationships, relationships amongst staff, just the ways in which a secure relationship can transform life outcomes for students, not just promoting academic learning, but growing social and emotional intelligence in students, and even has the power to heal trauma. And so when I realized all of these things, as I dove deeper into the field of social neuroscience or interpersonal neurobiology, I thought, well, what are we doing to prepare educators for this reality, for the fact that relationships are such a powerful intervention and such a huge part of an educator's job? And when I looked at teacher preparation, I was really surprised to find that despite the importance of relationships to student outcomes and the day-to-day life of an educator, that educator training and support predominantly focuses on the educator's content knowledge and instructional skills. And educators are kind of left hanging without the skills and support needed to build relationships. As a field, we're sort of crossing our fingers, hoping for the best. And the best teachers are natural at building relationships. But when I realized that there are skills, there's science, there's training and practices that we can bridge from counselor education into teacher education to help better equip educators for that role, that's when I was really compelled to start Fuel Ed with this mission to develop emotionally intelligent educators who can then go on to build relationship-driven schools. And so I founded Fuel Ed in 2012 with the pilot in Houston, Texas, and we've been growing since then. So that's a little bit about me, what drew me to the field, and what kind of inspired me to start Fuel Ed.
Oh, thank you, Megan. That's great. And Kelley, how did you find Fuel Ed, and what's the connection for you?
Yeah. So my professional aim was also to be a therapist. And so I became a therapist and right away became very interested in families and children. I'd actually worked as a birth doula throughout my entire, really my mid to late 20s and early 30s. And so had a real, I had put a lot of attention toward attachment in those very, very early days. And so naturally was gravitating toward family work and kind of the sort of coming at it from a different angle from Megan. As I was providing that kind of relational care to families, what I was seeing was kids who were thriving under that kind of therapeutic intervention, really, but then going to school and having a really different experience, especially kids who had histories of adverse experiences or trauma, were struggling to be in the classroom and to feel safe. And so I really wanted to sort of bridge over to education and think about how can the environments that kids are in, really a lot of schools, 40, 50 hours a week, how can those environments support a feeling of safety? And so a friend introduced me to Megan, shout out to Yvette. And really, I became a trainer right away, and the rest is history. I haven't really looked back.
Well, you guys are definitely talking my language. Megan and I, as a team, Megan really comes from the teacher, instructional school, traditional school background, and I'm the mental health background of the team. And I've been training with Dr. Bruce Perry for the last 5 years around the neuroscience and neurophysiology of trauma in the body. And I'm a phase 2 trainer in the neurosequential model for education and therapeutics. So I'm right there with you and like really understanding the neurophysiology of what is happening in our bodies and what as the adult. And I know Megan really is also grounded in this, even though she always says, well, I'm not, but you're totally nerded out on the brain stuff too. And just really thinking about how the intertwine between the adults in the building and what's happening in their bodies is really creating safe spaces for our children and our young people, and making them, creating spaces that either feel safe where they can learn and grow, or where they are in the protection mode and they're shut down and in a threat state that really prevents them from accessing curriculum. So I think we're on a similar plane here.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I appreciate that you noticed that and so early in your professional career, Megan, that disconnect. And what you said, one thing you said really resonated for me, which is good teachers do this anyway. And I think that's what's made social emotional learning so elusive still to this day is good teachers do it naturally. We naturally know to go there and do that. We build those connections. But if you aren't naturally good at building those connections, or you're not naturally strong as a teacher, and you find yourself in a classroom, and there are many, many, many people who fall in that category, it's really hard to be able to identify the intangibles of what's going wrong in that room. So I saw that a lot as, I was a teacher, and then I became a school administrator, and I've been in dozens and dozens of classrooms at this point, and tried my best to coach some teachers that were really struggling. And I couldn't put my finger on what was going on for quite a long time. Like, I knew it felt unsafe. I knew that there were like classroom management issues, but I too was like trying to like focus on these external indicators of success. I remember once a teacher's classroom fell apart, and there were lots of things that were going wrong in that room. But like my criticism, or the thing that I could write down, was like, well, maybe you shouldn't have kids cut out the activity before you do it. Maybe just cut the activity out first. Like, think ahead, because it became, what was supposed to be a 2-minute thing of kids cutting something out, and then they do an activity, became a half an hour management of kids with scissors in the classroom. But really what was true was that the kids didn't feel safe. She didn't feel grounded. She, when things started to go off in the room, like she just stood there like a statue and didn't do anything, right? Like, because she didn't have that connection with the kids. She didn't feel grounded. She didn't feel like she owned the room. And I think she didn't create this emotional safety or connection with the kids. So I think it's really, really important. And it's something that I've been trying to figure out for a long time. So I'm really excited about what you're doing. I loved, I love your mission, developing emotionally intelligent educators who create relationship-driven schools. I think that's so powerful. So what does it look like when you're doing that with teachers? Like, are you going into teacher preparation programs? Are you working with individual schools? But how does the program actually work?
Great question. So we predominantly at this stage in our organization work in-service teacher development, although our end game, our goal is for there to really be a revolution in teacher preparation where content knowledge and pedagogical skills are valued alongside the emotional intelligence and interpersonal skills of an educator. But we got started as a professional development program, and we continue to provide service as a professional development program. And what that really looks like is helping educators grow their knowledge of the science of relationships, their skills of relationships, and finally, the deeper self-awareness needed to build relationships. So for the science of relationships, that's kind of giving them a baseline understanding of the science of attachment and trauma. When educators learn about trauma, they begin to see their whole classroom, their whole work as educators through a really different lens. It's almost this catalytic moment where they say like, oh, that behavior of a student isn't just because I'm failing at my job or because these students are bad, but they start to understand students' behaviors through their trauma history, through their attachment histories. And that's a really big relief for educators to have that new lens and that new toolkit. Then the skills of relationships, once they're kind of empowered with this new way to see things, we give them skills that help them build secure relationships with students. Predominantly communication skills such as empathic listening and genuine communication. Those allow us to both tune in to what another person's feeling and really provide a student or a fellow staff with the space to feel what they're feeling and be accepting and validating of it. And genuine communication is really allowing the educator to own his or her own feelings and name and communicate that. Both of those will promote secure relationships, promote safety, promote learning. And then the last component is the self-awareness of relationships. This, I think, is probably the most cutting edge thing that Fuel Ed does. We essentially know from the science, from the research, and from all the many decades of literature around adult attachment, that the way in which you were parented or cared for, if you had secure early relationships, you're more likely to build secure relationships later. If you had insecure early relationships, you're more likely to build insecure relationships later. And that matters for teachers because relationships are what drives learning. And so if I'm an educator walking around with an insecure attachment style, like, 40, 50% of the population is, that's going to hurt your ability to build secure relationships in school. The good news is that our attachment style, the way we relate with others, can actually be changed at any time throughout the lifespan through the experience of a subsequent secure relationship and through the experience of really unpacking your history and processing it. So we help educators become more aware of what are their triggers, what is their own personal trauma, their own really family of origin challenges with their own caregivers, and start to connect that to how they're relating in schools so that they can begin to heal and build more secure relationships in their school environments.
So this is really super deep work. Like as you're talking, it's a lot of therapeutic interventions. It's really going deep with teachers around what's happening for them internally. And I'm curious around creating the space and time that it requires in order to get that kind of vulnerable opportunity to shift. How long are teachers engaging with your program and how often are you seeing them? And then what are they doing in between when you're working with them? Because I know, I currently support 18 schools with the behavioral health, and I'm building relationships over a long period of time, but time is the most critical aspect of this. And so you're working with the culture of the whole school as a whole. But how do you get in there to get that kind of time to create that vulnerable space to do that deep internal work?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So really our most powerful intervention currently, I would say, as the evaluator at Fuel Ed, the Whole Educator Collective it's actually only 3 days of intensive work where we scaffold and sequence very carefully the essentially coherent construction of a teacher's attachment story. And so we use a constructivist style. Our trainers are highly trained to provide security and empathic listening to teachers as they unpack this. And then beyond that, we actually used to provide counseling to a lot of teachers. And of course, when we're doing Whole Educator Collective, we have a module where we're essentially encouraging educators to continue on the journey with a professional counselor, and we provide a lot of scaffolding around that. Mm-hmm. But beyond that, we've begun in the last couple of years, especially with COVID, we began to really explore what would scalable, peer-driven cultural practices mm-hmm. look like mm-hmm. that could support this ongoing work. And so we actually have pulled an intervention from within our culture that's called stewarding at Fuel Ed. If you're a partner at Fuel Ed, you're always engaged in stewarding. So I've been doing it for almost 3 years now. And every 6 months we rotate. And what stewarding is really just the experience of a secure relationship. And so I meet once a week with my steward, and we both share what's going on for us and digest whatever the stressors or the triggers or, just our emotional struggles together. And it is a peer-driven practice, but it's protected by the commitment to empathic listening. And so the expectation is that we mirror well, that we listen, and that we are not dismissive or showing up in insecure ways with one another. And so by giving teachers that scaffolding and that skill around, one, here's your coherent story, here's your attachment story to unpack, and two, here's a way that you can enter into another person's story through empathic listening. Putting those two things together in a group of teachers has been really amazing to watch. For instance, right now we have our first group of fellows, which is a group of 12 teachers that we invited in from the early childhood space. They are all early childhood educators, and they spend an hour a week together unpacking their lives. And from what they're telling us, it's been really, really powerful because it's actually not normal right. For an educator to have a safe place to take their struggles.
Yeah, I really agree. I think that's really important. So I've been trying to get a lot of the same thing that you're talking about through mindfulness. So it's much lighter touch and more universal, but similar theory of action that I wrote about in my book and that I do a lot of speaking on, which is if we develop our self-awareness and emotional intelligence through a commitment to taking care of ourselves and through mindfulness practices or other ways of kind of deepening that just heartfulness towards ourselves, then we're able to then offer more of that to others, especially to our kids. So much lighter touch than what you're talking about. But I 100% agree. I think educators so rarely have the opportunity, and adults, frankly, rarely have the opportunity just to speak and be heard. But especially in a field, and probably nursing and others are very similar, where you're spending so much of your time giving to other people and you're running around and you're moving so quickly. The idea of stopping and just reflecting on ourselves is pretty novel, actually, and very rare, but it's so essential when we're educators and the thought, and, I've spent a lot of time thinking about when our brains are on or off, right? So when we're running a classroom and managing things, actually, we don't have such a good hold on all that subconscious programming that's running the show. And so if we have biases in there that we don't know about or that have gone unchecked, or our own, patterning that we grew up with. I'm the non-psychologist in the room, you can tell, because I don't use the right language. Like that shows up, right? Because when all the other things are happening, that, all that subconscious stuff is running the show. We're not even aware of it. So we can very easily say and do things that can cause harm to our kids and create unsafe learning environments. Unintentionally, but because we're not manning the store, so to speak. So it's for me that's really exciting. What an easy and light touch or easy lift, relatively speaking, to create the space for educators to talk with one another and to share that together.
So we have come up on our first break. It's hard to believe. I know, right? And so we're going to go into it. When we come back from the break, I really want to hear about how I love this idea of stewardship and also creating natural healing spaces and communities of healing and therapeutic environments. And this is an area that I've been digging in deeply. So I'm really excited to come back and unpack some of the ways in which your team has been able to bring this to schools and communities. So we will be right back.
Hey listeners, are you enjoying this show? And do you want to hear more? Then please subscribe to our show on your favorite streaming platform. Like this show and tell others about us. We are available on Castbox, Deezer, Podcast Addict, Podchaser, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Spreaker, and Apple Podcasts. So please connect with us there. You also can watch shows live being recorded on our Facebook site, The Awakening Educator. You can connect with us via Instagram or Twitter at The Awakening Educator. And you can also subscribe to our newsletter. We've been busy recording a ton of terrific shows that will be rolling out over the rest of this year. So we would love to be able to have you be a regular member of our community. Thank you so much and have a great, great day. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. So when we went on break, just before we went on break, Susan said that we'd come back and talk a little bit about ways that you can build those connections. And see, I already lost all the language, Susan, that you said so well. That's why I actually wanted you to bring us back. But remind me of what it's called again. It's called
Stewarding. Yeah.
Stewarding. I've been watching Patrick Stewart on the latest Star Wars Trek, so I should be knowing that. So stewarding and other ways of building these bonds within schools. So Susan asked a really great question before we went on break. So if you could share a little bit more about that, that'd be terrific.
Yes. So I think that what is so powerful about stewardship and some of the other healing spaces that we promote is that, we kind of had this realization at Fuel Ed, whereas we were like, this is a gap in educator preparation and educators need to be taught about these things. And while we still think that's true, the reality is that educators' environment is the school. And until schools change their cultures, be places that deliberately develop the social and emotional competencies of educators in an ongoing way, develop and support that, we're never really going to solve this problem wholesale. And so that's when we really recognize the need for schools to transform some of their policies and practices to create more therapeutic and healing spaces for the educators, because it's only when we provide that for the educators where they're going to be able to fill their cup up enough to provide that for students. I think what differentiates some of these approaches like stewardship from some of the other really fantastic mindfulness approaches out there for educators is really this idea that we grow and learn through relationship. And that's not just teachers and students, that's educators too. That's us as adults. And so for educators to grow in their own self-awareness, to grow in their own healing of their trauma, to grow in their ability to trust in other relationships, to have that confidence in themselves, we believe the most powerful way to do that is through relationship. It's the relationships that we can get more regulated. It's the relationships that we can kind of start to attain that like resolution around sticky problems. And it's the relationships that we build resilience. And so if we believe that that's the case for students, they need strong teacher-student relationships. We all should be supporting the students. Then we need to first and foremost be supporting the educators and providing them a network, community of secure relationships so they can feel safe in schools and thereby provide that same level of safety to students.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I 100% agree. And Susan, I saw you're about to ask a question. So I'll be quick. I agree. I mean, I think for me, there's a need for developing some kind of internal capacity first, or willingness to know yourself and see yourself before you enter into doing that with others, especially when we're thinking about identity and the impact of white supremacy in this country, and how a lot of our social norms can be, harmful to other community members. So in the model I developed, you work on yourself and then you work on the school, and part of the school is really developing those trusting relationships and an ability to talk with one another and hold one another accountable. So I 100% am with you. I have a lot of questions about the how, but I will hold them because Susan has a question and this is really her field and I'm jumping in. So Susan.
No, it's good. Part of me is really bringing up a lot of how I've been shifting around thinking about things for the last couple of years. few years back, I created a weekly healing art space for teachers that was voluntary and drop-in, and it was a pretty powerful space. And I've definitely been working with teachers around self-care and managing their own internal challenges. And this year has been just more difficult than in the 20 years that I've been in the district and working with schools, teachers, and families and educators. The bandwidth of which they're being asked to be stretched to is just incredibly impactful for all of us. And in the work and the learning that I've been doing with Dr. Perry and the neurosequential model, I've really been shifting to thinking about healing spaces, therapeutic spaces, dosing and spacing of therapeutic opportunities, rather than, and it sounds like you're moving in this direction as well, sort of the professionalism of clinical work, and really starting to recognize that we're not going to be able to solve this problem. There's not enough therapy in the world to shift and heal us as a community or as a group. And that we really have to start to think of ourselves as supporting the therapeutic environments and healing spaces of the adults that are in that space, so that they can show up in ways that first do no more harm, but also create healing spaces for kids who are experiencing whatever's going on outside of the building. And so I've really been digging deep in this idea of the therapeutic or healing environments through art and music and dance, and also just being seen, being heard, and being held. And it sounds like the stewardship part, I'm really curious, because it's as a therapist, we have this model that we have, everybody has supervision as a clinician, right? We all have group and individual supervision or consultation. It's sort of baked right in, and teachers just haven't had that. And it's not part of the culture, and it's not part of the norm. So bringing that in as a norm where we're showing up in this coaching or healing space individually, what have been some of the barriers to bringing that in and making that part of the culture of schools in the building for teachers on a daily basis?
Yeah, I'll speak to this one. So I would say, and I'm guessing you guys might agree, that the number one barrier would be truly the time in the space. And that the caveat there is that everyone we've taken through stewarding so far has had pretty clear, discrete training in empathic listening. Mm-hmm. And so part of why we think the intervention is safe enough to bring into a school is because we've given some scaffolding around that. But truly, what we see happening is that when a school cannot create space, literally time, to embed and normalize that, and I think that comes from the leadership, to say this, we're committed to this practice for the sake of our teachers feeling safe and seen, then it is really, really challenging for educators to commit. Because I'm married to an educator of 21 years, and they're stretched. And so, if their leaders aren't saying this matters, and I'm making space for this, and I'm encouraging you to do this, then it's really likely to fall off the plate.
Mm-hmm. That's such a great point, Kelley. And I'm wondering, like, how do you make that sale to leaders? Because I agree, leaders hold not only the resource of time, and I was going to say money, but they also hold the resource of time, and they really set the tone in the school. So if they don't believe in it, or if they don't value this time over other things, they're not going to make the time for it, and it's not going to create a safe space for teachers to really engage. So how do you all enroll people in doing this work so that they can start to see that it's valuable?
Right. Well, I think that, again, part of how we are doing that is by working directly with leaders to develop their own self-awareness. Mm-hmm. And so essentially we wouldn't ask a group of teachers to do something that their leader wasn't doing. Hi, Mick. And so, but actually I would say this has been a huge barrier for us, right? We have actually worked with schools and failed for this very reason, that the leaders haven't been invested in making the time in this space. And part of our rationale for starting the fellowship is that we want to develop leaders, right? We know that the people we have in our fellowship are leaders in their field, and they are growing into having more and more leadership responsibility. And so by investing so deeply in those leaders, we really see it as a generational impact. Like, they're going to go into their environments and they're going to go in with this norm of, oh, we have to have time and space to be safe and seen. And we build our schedule around this. We build our priorities around this.
Yeah, I think that's so powerful. Susan, I don't know if you have a question, but I keep jumping in.
It's okay. I just started to think about the policy end of things, because I'm sitting in spaces with leaders at this point, with principals and admin who I truly believe value this and know how important it is. But particularly in this year with COVID, and particularly in this year with everything that's happening, they're not. It's not that they don't value it; it's that there just really isn't the time. And I also feel like as professionals, how do we start to advocate? We're showing up for teachers. We're sitting with leaders. We're problem solving with them. But is your organization involved in policy and advocacy? And I'm also curious, Megan, I want to put you on the spot a little bit about being a school board member and how this plays into where we're looking at things from the school board perspective, because I don't think this can be fixed in the building necessarily. We need really a paradigm shift.
That's a good point. And I'll let maybe Megan or Kelley talk, and then I can jump in, because actually I did get to have training as a new administrator in emotional intelligence and awareness. And it's totally shifted how I approach things, but I'll add my 2 cents later. So you two first, and then I'll jump in.
Yeah. So part of our theory of change is essentially not only working with educators to grow their emotional intelligence, but then supporting them as they build relationship-driven schools. So we have some amazing stories of educators or administrators who've gone on from our training, and after having that initial awareness and really big internal shift, folks talk about, I changed my relationship with my husband or my wife, and then it kind of really influences their professional world. But for those really hungry go-getters, they then go on and change when they're in positions of power, things like their hiring practice. We have one principal who started recruiting and screening educators for their empathic abilities.
Wow.
Just what's on their resume. We have one of our alumni who actually, after several years in her job and seeing the impact of this work, said, I'm going to start my own school that doesn't have kind of the traditional behavior management models that actually can provide this type of in-depth developmental work for the educators. Or another educator who set up kind of the support groups, listening groups for the teachers. So what we want to see, what we believe will create the sea change we want, is a lot of actors out there, individual educators and groups of educators, really creating change, not just in their interpersonal sphere, but really policies and practices on the ground that embed and bake in this value and this core foundation of secure relationships into all that they do. So I think that can create a really big shift. And I think it's one of the most powerful ways, because policy is really, really important, but it can be easily kind of misinterpreted or kind of played out on the ground. But if you have emotionally intelligent educators at the center, they'll be able to easily identify which of these practices of our traditional educational model are really antithetical to what we know about how learning happens through secure relationships. And there are many, many, many. And we at FuelEd couldn't identify them, but the educators on the ground, once they have this new frame and this new way of being, they're really hungry to make some of those changes.
Yeah. And all I would add to that is that teachers are already very naturally organized into groups, right? We have a professional learning committee. I mean, our communities, all kinds of groups happen in school settings, professional groups. And so I think that, Megan, I think your point is really important, that when you give a teacher the experience of the shift in frame and shift in how you see others and yourself, then they can take the groups and the practices that already exist and shift them to what we would say, I guess, is a higher purpose.
But I will say to add on. Oh, excuse me, Megan.
Go ahead, Megan.
I will say to kind of double down on what Susan was speaking to is that none of this can happen without leadership's consciousness changing as well. I love the title of your podcast because it really is about awakening and growing in consciousness. And it can't just happen for the educators, teachers, that is, when we have teachers on the ground growing in this awareness, but they're in systems where they have a principal where they don't have a secure relationship, or that principal has a district administrator where they don't have a secure relationship. It actually can drive educators more quickly out of the profession when they realize, like, I see this new way and I have no path forward towards it. It can be really demoralizing. And so we think like the number one most powerful thing is for all principals to kind of grow on this journey, because the more the principals can see their job as providing secure relationships and conditions and a climate for secure relationships and safety and being seen for teachers, the more the ripple down effects will take place in a really powerful way. But it must happen at the leadership level, from the school to the district to the board leadership level, that growth in that awareness.
And I'd add to that the federal level and the state level.
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, we need, as a country, we need to attend to social emotional well-being and care on a deeper level. I mean, I think we're increasingly getting more destructive to one another. I was going to say that I did get to have the benefit when I was doing my administrative credential to actually learn from two professors who created an empathetic leadership model. So it's Dr. Diane Cattell and Dr. Pete Mesa, and they had both been superintendents and school leaders, and they were professors, and they had a long standing experience in school. And so they have a whole approach to systems change and how you do leadership that's all about emotional intelligence and self-awareness, and then how do you apply that kind of empathy towards understanding and making changes through a school setting. So I didn't like even realize how much that had influenced me until recently. I was on an airplane ride and I was reading Dr. Cattell's book, and it was like all, like everything I just written about in my book, like it was so much, some of the connections were there. So I think it is this powerful way of going about it, because for me, I didn't learn as many of the tactical elements of how to be an administrator in that program. I learned some, but I think, and I'm a finance person, and I think the finance course was like, I don't know, 10 weeks or something, and maybe not even that. And I kind of wished I had that, but actually a lot of the tactical elements of how to be a teacher or a school leader, they're important, but they can also be learned on the job and kind of have to be in a lot of ways. But if you're not predisposed to some of these things before you enter in, then you have to learn it later, and then you're competing with that time and energy and burnout and all those other quotients that are there that I think are really a problematic issue. That's why I've been wanting to bring mindfulness and any emotional intelligence and awareness into pre-service teacher programs and pre-service programs for administrators too, because I think that's just how you do it, and you don't even know that you're doing it differently, and you have all these benefits. So I think that's really true. I do think you can make changes. I think your point is well taken, Megan. And I often tell people, like, look, just start with yourself, because I think sometimes the change can feel so big.
Yeah. Right.
That the idea of like getting your administrator on board and getting the system on board and getting even like your colleague on board to do this can feel really huge. So I often say, like, look, if you start with yourself, you're going to feel better. I do agree that for some folks, when they start to feel better and they have that awareness, then feeling better means stepping aside. And actually choosing to lead the profession. So I think that's a really valid point. What I'd love to ask about, and for me, one of the reasons why emotional intelligence is important, beyond all the other things we just named, is it's a powerful and important gateway to becoming aware around implicit bias and how white supremacy and bias show up in our classrooms. And so I'm wondering if you touch on that, and how do you touch on that in your program?
I'm actually wondering, because it's a big question, and we are up on our second break. So I think what I'd like to do is take us out on break and give you an opportunity to answer that when we come back. And it'll also give you a chance to sort of think and ground it, because It's a good one. I mean, it's a really important.
Was it a big one? Okay.
Well, it is. It's an important one. I think you and I both value this as our core value, and really important. And I don't want it to be shortchanged by a break.
Are you ready to change the way we do school? Yeah, me too. This is Megan Sweet from the Awakening Educator, and I've designed programming that empowers educators to reimagine how they approach their work. The pandemic has laid bare what most of us already knew. Our schools are under-resourced. Our system is set up to fail our most vulnerable students. Our educators are burned out and overwhelmed, and we all deserve better. With almost 30 years in education and 15 dedicated to leading school reform, I have been there and I get it. I've sat in the same seats that many of you have. I've been a classroom teacher and a school administrator. I've led district, county, and statewide reforms. I've coached dozens of teachers, principals, and executive leaders, and I've partnered with students, parents, and community activists. I have the scars from a lifetime of scrapping out in education, but also the lived experience that change is possible. After facing the prospect of quitting education myself, I began a journey to understand how I could stay in the profession I love, but do it in a way that was sustainable. Here's what I now know. It begins with self-care. Prioritizing ourselves can feel counterintuitive for educators, but when we give without attending to our own needs, eventually we run out of resources and burnout ensues. But when we stop fighting the system and instead look inward for the answers we seek, we live more empowered lives and are better able to create the educational settings where our students will thrive. Here's what I also know. We already have the answers inside of us, we just sometimes need help getting them out. And that's where I come in. I love supporting educators to find their inner voice and match all those school smarts with their innate instincts about what works best for students. My superpowers are listening well, synthesizing ideas, and breaking complex processes into understandable and accessible parts. How will we do it? It all starts with doing what I call self-work, dedicating time and attention to building a relationship with ourselves. We do this in a course I call the Beliefs Lab. By the end of this course, you'll understand why self-care is essential for being an effective educator, and you'll have strategies you can use right now. You will also get a handle on some of those beliefs that are helping you and those that are getting in the way. The next step is doing the school work, leading classroom and school change. In the course I call The Cycle, you will learn a process for realizing goals for yourself and for your educational context simultaneously. You will also have deeper insights and strategies for putting your plans into action. Want more support as you engage in this self-work and schoolwork? I've got you covered. My personalized coaching and consulting services are designed to meet you in your school right where you are and support you to clarify your vision for the future. Want to know even more about what I do? My book is a great place to start. An Educator's Guide for Using Your 3 Eyes details the self-work and schoolwork that I described above and talks about concrete ways that you can start to feel better right now. If you want to learn more about how to work with me in the courses I just described, please come to my website, www.your3eyes.com. That's YOUR3EYES.com. I can't wait to support you to realize a better future for yourself and for your school community. And we're back. Welcome back, everybody.
I know, it's very funny.
So silly. For those of you who are listening to this later, our commercial breaks are just a 5-second goodbye, and then we come right back. I'm
going to edit that part out when we come back for those that aren't hearing it. You like it? Okay.
What's happening behind the scenes, the magic of the show. Before we went away on a commercial break, I did ask this question around how do you see and support educators to both first inside themselves, which for me is the reason why I actually have this start with yourself first and develop your own self-care and self-awareness first, because sometimes admitting that we have biases, and we all do, and admitting how they're impacting our students is so painful that we can't even acknowledge it to ourselves, let alone to someone else. So first, how do we start to become aware of that ourselves, and how do you support that? And then how do you address the issues of bias, systemic racism, and inequities that are in our system as we start to do some of those connections across individuals? So that was the question.
Yeah, sure. It's a really important question. So yes, I want to take my time answering, but I think that The first point that I think is really important is that not only is it painful to begin to unpack our stories as individuals, but it is also painful to unpack our collective stories. And so stories of collective trauma, of racism, of, harm done, and a lack of safety that we may have experienced at a collective level is, it's a lot.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot. It's overwhelming. And so, one thing that I think is often missing in this whole conversation about being able to process racial trauma or to own and take responsibility for being a part of white supremacy, is that the skills of empathic communication are actually really, really helpful in these conversations, right? Because what do we see most often? We see, at least on the part of the white majority, we will see defensiveness, right? Or dismissiveness. And so empathic listening as a skill that we believe is very, very teachable actually protects people from being dismissive, from being unempathetic, from not being able to hold space for others. But I think more important than that, what we've seen, we actually asked about this for the first time on our most recent survey for our alumni, and kind of wondering like, well, what does Fuel Ed have to do with this conversation? And so we asked teachers to kind of tell us like, hey, have you connected this work to your actual DEI efforts in your school communities? And essentially, some of the teachers we asked just said, I am able to see my students' stories through their eyes and lens more than I could have in the past. And I think that speaks to what you've been saying all along, Megan, about this connection between starting with self-awareness paradoxically creates almost a sense of others' awareness. So in the science, that's called theory of mind, or the ability to really tap into the internal experience of another human. And so as we begin to acknowledge our own pain and our own stories, what teachers have told us is that does transfer to an increased capacity to understand what another's experience might be like, moving us out of dismissiveness, out of denial, out of defensiveness even, and into that mirroring space where it's like, I'm here to listen. Whoa, that sounds hard. Whoa, wow. And so I think that part of our role in this whole conversation is to help educators of color to have safe spaces to process whatever stories, whatever collective stories are there, but also for all educators to have the skills and the self-awareness to be able to, one, tap into another story that's outside of your own, and to meet that story with real empathic skills. And yeah, I don't know, Meg, would you add anything to that as you think through, as we've sat in this a lot lately?
I think that was beautifully said, Kelley. And I think that is what really underlies some of these difficult conversations that have begun to happen, that need to happen. There's certainly an increased awareness of the need for some of these more difficult conversations across racial lines. But how well equipped are we to have these?
Yeah, and it makes me think of the synergistic nature of it, right? That it's the individual, the interpersonal, the historical, and the systemic ways in which racialized trauma is impacting all of our systems. And so each of us are sitting within those systems with our own history, our own experience of interpersonal, and then within the historical context that we're in. And so creating this empathetic space of listening allows each person within the system to be seen and heard, but also to be able to recognize the ways in which they're participating in that system. And even just by acknowledging and participating, you're taking the first step of not perpetuating.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Agree. And I think self-awareness is an essential ingredient to be able to show up in the space. And so providing the scaffolding for that is really important.
Yeah, I think I really appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, I think Susan and I talk about this a lot, so we're sold and we agree. And, I think I keep talking about us needing to reinvest in our educators. And really, I think that's one of our biggest problems in education. Sometimes I call it reprofessionalize, which is also true. And that I think our profession has become so disrespected and watered down by so many different people, through pay, through public perception, through the lack of preparation and care we actually give to our educators before they're standing in front of children. And yet we're surprised that our education system isn't working well. So investing in our educators and really showing that we care about them, that we understand that actually they're professionals with a high degree of expertise and knowledge who deserve to be invested in and supported in that way, I think is really powerful and important, and that their well-being is important. I also think that the more educators understand this, they'll stop doing the harm to each other, because I just want to name that we also do a lot of harm to one another around those expectations. So as one of those teachers that immediately got tapped to lead things and then followed the leadership path all the way through to the district office leadership, I'm that person. It's the hard workers, the people who don't take time for themselves, who don't say that they're in pain or have needs, that just kind of put their head down and get through it and get results.
Yep.
We're the ones that become the leaders, and therefore we're the ones that perpetuate that cycle, first in our classrooms, then in our schools, and then from district leadership levels. And so until we as educators start to see and value our own need and care first, and why that's such an important investment in our students' well-being, because I think people don't see that connection. Like, if the adults aren't okay, the kids aren't going to be okay. It's just how that's going to keep working. I just am desperate for us to break that cycle, and I really appreciate your program. I'm guessing you've been well-placed because of the pandemic to have your programming here, and I'm just wondering how the pandemic has shifted or shaped your approach, or how it's been supportive during this highly unusual and even more stressful time.
And I think that the issues that FuelEd has always stood for have just become more present in the national consciousness. This idea that students and adults enter the classroom and school with trauma, the fact that relationships are really necessary and really healing to promote and restore emotional safety, and the need for schools to be places where social emotional learning can happen. That's what FuelEd has been essentially promoting and been about since 2012. But when I started FuelEd, it was, No Child Left Behind era. So it was having to make the case about why academic learning can happen if we help educators build the skills to build relationships. And it was a lot of, kind of logical jumps, which are all, the science supports that. But now it's like mental health for the sake of mental health, educator wellness for the sake of educator wellness, which is a welcome change. And I hope that it not only sticks and stays, but that it creates genuine change to the way we do school. I would hate to lose this moment where all of our consciousness is around the fact that we've all been through trauma, and the fact that we really need schools to be places that support entire communities, not just the students. But the adults, the parents, the entire ecosystem needs to be attuned to the whole person's needs. So, of course, logistical things have changed, like taking our program online and this and that. But I think the biggest thing is seeing the shift in the ethos about what our education community is caring about.
I 100% agree.
I would add to that. It seems like everyone now wants to talk about the importance of educator well-being. And at FuelEd, we've been focused for a long time on the kind of brass tacks of how but the how of educator well-being. And so I've noticed this year, just more people asking us, like, how do we do this? This is important. How do we do it? And I think that's a really beautiful shift to see.
That's actually going to be sorry, Susan. I keep
No, go ahead. It's all right, Megan. Go ahead.
All right. Well, I was going to say, one of our Facebook guests asked earlier, like, do you have a toolkit or something? But are there some tips or strategies that you can share to start bringing? Obviously, this would be also be a good time to hear about your program. But also, are there things people can do right away? Because I often think of teachers who are like, great, I want it. And yet I can't get my administrator to pay for this, or I can't, so what are some things that folks can do right away, and how can people plug into your program if they're interested in doing more?
Yeah. So just the first thing is our website's fueledschools.org. And if you kind of go to that website, you'll see a lot of blogs and free webinars we offer on the topic. If you go to a specific site that's not immediately accessible, but if you kind of plug it in, fueledschools.org/BLBS, what you'll get to is actually a checklist that you can download for free of secure versus insecure attachment figure behavior. That's a bunch of jargon that can help you essentially assess whether
is it fueled, FUELED.org? Okay.
Fueled Schools, plural.
Fueled Schools.
Yeah. And then if you do /BLBS, there's a really great toolkit you can download that will help you assess whether you as an educator or administrator are behaving in a way that's more likely to promote secure relationships, safety, and learning, or behaving in ways that's just more likely to promote insecure relationships, a lack of safety, and shut down learning and growth. And so just that simple awareness of knowing what the science says, what does it look like to really be a secure or insecure attachment figure, someone who promotes secure relationships or insecure relationships, is really huge, just to begin to know where to dig in further. Of course, outside of FUELED's resources, we really advocate for counseling, therapy for all those in the education sphere. Of my first impetus, as I mentioned earlier, for starting FUELED was training as a counselor and realizing, hey, counselors are expected to get their own personal counseling so that they can be really in a healthy position to be able to build relationships that are healing and growth promoting. Why wouldn't it be the same for educators who also build relationships that can be healing, growth promoting? And so really, really encourage folks to find a counselor. If they don't have one yet, we recommend person-centered counseling because it is a relational approach to counseling and psychotherapy. And then finally, learn about empathic listening, mirroring, or the fields of attachment theory. I think adult attachment is a really powerful place to dig into, if not through FUELED's workshops, through your own independent reading and study is a really great way to grow your awareness of your own attachment style and tendencies. But would love to hear what Dr. Munger thinks, if there's any other recommendations.
Yeah, I would just reiterate that we have free community events. And so come join our alumni community. You don't have to actually be an alumni. You can just be a part of our little community. We love to provide free space where you can feel safe and seen as an educator and have that experience. And then, I think about some of our, like Dan Siegel and Tina Payne Bryson, some of our, I guess, mentors really, and some of the books that they've written, like The Power of Showing Up,
The Whole Brain Child.
The Whole Brain Child. Those books have really beautiful deep dives into adult attachment and how the way that we show up matters. But we would love to see anyone listening at our community events. That'd be really cool.
Yeah, well, I will definitely check it out. If you're also interested in learning more about attachment, there's a great podcast called Therapists Uncensored, and they are attachment therapists and interview a lot of different folks from different perspectives. And some of what you were talking about really resonated around some of their work as well. Dr. Perry talks a lot about regulate, relate, reason, and it sounds like all of that is really connected in there. It's like, are we creating spaces so that teachers just have enough time to decompress and then connect with each other so that they can show up and do good instruction? And then are we doing that for our kids as well? And so how are we creating those spaces that have that sequence of what we know works. And I hear you. We're getting away from for the sake of increased academics, for mental health for the sake of mental health, wellness for the sake of wellness. But I also truly believe that if we do that, we're going to have a lot of data that shows that kids are actually learning, enjoying learning, and becoming lifelong learners in a way that drilling and the drill and kill does not provide.
100%.
I mean, there's research on that, and that's often what I do to talk to my educator friends, and I think there's a lot on both the impact of, so Zaretta Hammond's book, Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain, is a really good example of that. But also a lot of other, research shows that when kids feel shut down, I mean, we go into fight, flight, freeze. This part shuts off, which happens to be the learning part of our brain. And so when kids don't feel safe, they're not learning effectively anyway. And actually, when they feel safe and they feel connected, then they're able to learn and be receptive in a totally different way. And so I think the learning does show up there. It doesn't do the satisfying, like you can't connect. This is the challenge with mindfulness, any other social emotional learning modality, is you can't connect X to X in terms of like kids feel safe and happy. And look, there's a 10% gain in test scores, which I know is what people often look for. And that's the challenging part of working in this field is, educators are, even if they get it and they want to go there, they are forced to show the direct connection between what they're doing with something that's measurable. And that constantly, I think, gets in our way of being able to do some of the more innovative work that needs to happen.
Absolutely.
I totally agree with you, Megan, that this is the moment. I mean, I feel more in love with educators than I ever did before. And I've always been a proud educator since I was 21. That's all I've ever known. And I started teaching because I was going to prove that being an educator was easier than I thought as a kid. So I've been humbled on that one, but I have loved educators ever since. And just fell in love with the profession, watching how we're navigating this time. And it's just so crucial that we provide our educators that care. Susan, you asked a while back, what can board members do? As a board member myself, I think there's a few things we can do. One is treat each other with care and set that tone, which is something I do on a regular basis, of like help our parents and our larger community understand what our educators are going through. And by educators, I just want to be clear that I include anybody who works in a school. So the folks that are working in our cafeteria, that are cleaning our schools, our admin assistants, everyone who is in a school is an educator to me. So understanding just the incredible hard work that every single person is doing, encouraging kindness and some empathy, and then demonstrating it in how I interact with staff is really important, but also in setting that standard with parents and community members as they're engaging with me, is at least ways that I can do that now, that I think any board member can do, outside of then like mandating social emotional learning policies or things like that, which can happen, but that's much more,
that's the long game. We got to do both. We got to do the long game, and we got to do the day-to-day stuff. We got to keep educators. So we are at time, and so I think that was a beautiful place to end. We need to take care of the educators we have, and then create a more loving, kind profession that invites more high-quality folks in that want to stay and dedicate themselves to this incredibly important work. I'm so grateful for all that you guys do. This was a really powerful conversation. I'm excited. I hope this grows. It's been my life work. And so it's been a beautiful conversation.
Any final words, Megan and Kelley?
We're just grateful to be here and excited for the growing movement to fuel schools with the power of relationships.
Yeah, so exciting. Yeah, so grateful for your time today.
Thanks. I'll see you guys in a couple weeks. Have a good night.
Thanks, everyone.
Class is dismissed. Wasn't that fun? Susan and Megan are always happy to greet you on the next episode of The Awakening Educator. Connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. Education is the foundation for a brighter future. Open your eyes to The Awakening Educator